Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Blair, and I'm one of the managers here at Baker Bookhouse. And I want to thank you for attending this event hosted by Baker Bookhouse and Brazos Press. We are delighted to welcome you all here. Tonight's event is entitled, What is, in fact, Biblical and Christian? Here to answer that question and to discuss many other important topics, we have Dr. Beth Allison Barr and Dr. Kristin Du Mez in a conversation facilitated by Dr. Scot McKnight. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Barr, Dr. Du Mez, and Dr. McKnight. Dr. Beth Allison Barr is a professor of history and associate dean of the Graduate School at Baylor University, where she specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. She's the author of The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which is just released on April 20th from Brazos Press. Dr. Kristin Du Mez is the professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She is the author of best-selling and widely discussed Jesus and John Wayne. Dr. Scot McKnight is a scholar, writer, speaker, and professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. He is the co-author, along with his daughter, Laura Barringer, of a church called Tove. One final note before we begin the conversation. If you enjoy the event tonight, be sure to subscribe to the Brazos Press email newsletter to learn more about future events and other opportunities to engage with Brazos Press authors. We will be dropping a link to sign up for the e-newsletter, as well as links to all the books I just mentioned in the chat box throughout the evening. Now to welcome Dr. Barr, Dr. Du Mez, and Dr. McKnight. I'll hand it over to Dr. McKnight to begin the conversation.
Here we go. All right. Well, I'm extremely honored to be with you this evening and to be with these two wonderful new scholars that we get to discuss biblical complementarianism, or so-called biblical complementarianism, and the rise of masculinist Christianity in the United States in the 20th century with Kristin Du Mez. As you said, I am the author with my daughter, Laura Barringer, of a book that has the title, A Church Called Tove. And as a result of that book, I'm being asked, because of Kristin's book and Beth's book and others, I'm being asked, and things like this are being said to me on a regular basis. There seems to be a movement now challenging the complementarian understanding of the relationship of men and women in the home, in the church, and in society. They asked me if I think this is the case. My response is unequivocally, yes, for sure. Something is going on. Amy Bird's book, Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, Kristin's Jesus and John Wayne, and now Beth's The Making of Biblical Womanhood are not obscure journal articles in arcane journals no one will read, but they are instead very accessible, wide-ranging, and profoundly challenging books to patriarchy. Plus, they have 3 great titles. I mean, how can you beat these titles? Everybody says, what's this with John Wayne? And how does Beth Barr know how these things were made? Well, these books are to use and to deconstruct a masculinist image, 3 punches in the nose of the ideology of patriarchy. They form an argument that complementarianism is a social construct. That is a huge statement that I just made. That it is that this complementarianism and patriarchy are not from the Bible, but from specific social constructs and contexts in our society, and they have particular social agendas. The sometimes vehement, at times even disgusting reactions to these books, all 3 of them, in fact, demonstrate the potency of the criticisms that Amy Bird, Kristin Du Mez, and Beth Allison Barr have proposed. I'm honored tonight to share time with both of these women, Beth and Kristin, two scholars whose Christian witness has been consistent, whose commitment to the church is clear, and whose new books present to the church a fresh, critical evaluation of the ideology of complementarianism. So I want to welcome Beth and Kristin, and I want to begin with a question. And this is something that I've asked too, but I know you two would like to discuss it. How have you two gotten to know one another? Because I see you together on a particular blog. So how did you get to know one another?
Well, thanks, Scott. Thanks for introducing us. And that's a fun question. I'll start it and I'll let Kristin jump in whatever she wants to. But it actually started way back in 2013 when I was trying to, or actually 2012, when I think it started, when I was applying for a Louisville Institute grant. And I began looking at who else had applied for them. And I found somebody at Calvin whose name was Kristin Du Mez. And I went and asked one of my colleagues, I said, do you know Kristin Du Mez? And he was like, oh, yes, I went to graduate school with her. And I started looking and found out that she worked on gender inclusive language. And I was organizing a conference on women and the Bible. And so I sent Kristin an email and said, hey, do you want to come to Baylor? And that actually is what really started it.
Very good.
Yeah. So that's when we first met. And I think, right away we connected. We saw what we were doing historically, even though we work in completely different time periods. I think we had a sense for how our historical research was relevant for women and men in the church today. And I think we also kind of bonded as two women working in a male-dominated field as Christian historians. And so we connected on that level. I know I felt that way.
Yes.
And then it wasn't long before, or I guess, a couple of years, I don't even know, when Beth came and invited me to join her at the Anxious Bench blog, where she was already blogging. And I remember that conversation vividly because I at first said no. I was like, I'm too busy. I'm working on a second book. I have 3 kids. And Beth told me, no, you're going to find out that it feels like it's too much, but you're going to find out that the more you write for blogging, the more you're going to be able to write for your academic writing. And I totally didn't believe her. But I'm really bad at saying no. So I let her talk me into it. And I will have to say, you were so right. I mean, the writing that we do on the blog, I learned to be a lot quicker. And I think I really found my voice, a popular voice that ended up transferring really well to trade publishing.
Well, and Kristin's first blog on the Anxious Bench, I think may still be one of our highest ones ever. It was one she wrote on Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, where she analyzed their speech, and it was crazy. It went everywhere. She ended up on Canadian news stations and all sorts of stuff. So it was a lot of fun.
I was a linguistic expert. In every interview, I would start with saying, you guys need to know I am not a linguist. I'm just a historian who dabbled. And yes, that was the gift that kept giving.
Yes, that was fun. So,
well, I want to express my thanks to you, Kristin, and to you, Beth, on behalf of my family, my wife, Chris, and my daughter, Laura, for the contribution that you have made to our family's life because of the sterling quality of your book, the challenges that you've made, and the confidence that you have given to women in the church. So I'm the host, but I just want to tell you, I want to jump in and say a huge thanks from us.
Thanks.
So I have a question. All right. The first question is for Beth. And Beth, what most influenced you in finding so-called biblical womanhood unbiblical?
Yeah. So I think I just wrote a book on that, Scott. But essentially it was the disconnect. It was the growing disconnect between what I knew as a scholar and what I knew as a Christian who just read my Bible, and the way that I was treated as well as I saw other women treated in the church, especially being in a church that was not only complementarian at the time, but was becoming increasingly rigid in how they implemented and, kept women from serving in various roles. And so that disconnect continued to grow in my life. And in fact, I talk about it in the book. I had a moment. And it was a moment when I was teaching. I mean, we have all of these epiphanies while we're teaching. I'm sure Kristin can relate too. And I had, on a whim, I had one of my students read Romans 16 out loud in class. And I just felt like somebody had socked me in the stomach while the student was reading it, because it suddenly realized to me, I was like, there are women in the highest positions in the church documented in Romans 16. They are apostle, they are deacon, they are house church leader, they are co-worker with Paul. And I was like, why in the world are we telling women they can't do these things when Paul is giving them permission to do so? And so it was that disconnect. I think it was all the pieces of my life kind of came together in one moment. And I thought, this is wrong. So
that's good. I just want to add, because I see it in your book all over the place. There is an obsession in the complementarian circles with authority and hierarchy. And the New Testament talks about the giftedness of women. And that is dropped so often in this ideology. And so when I read your book, I kept thinking, oh, you're getting right at the heart of these things. So Andrew Bartlett has written a book on what the New Testament says about women. And he recently has said that he has been, sort of stunned and surprised about people who review his book, and they say things that aren't in the book at all. And he says it's almost like there's an inability to read my book and see what I'm actually saying. And so I turn to Kristin here. We all want to know the answer to this question. In the months since your book has been published, it's not quite a year, what have you noticed most about the pushback and about the affirmations?
Yeah, it's been so interesting, and I mean, it's just always an honor to have the book reviewed at all, to have the book read and seriously engaged. So it's been really quite thrilling. One of the things that has jumped out to me in terms of the pushback and negative reviews is a widespread misunderstanding among those who don't like the book, that it is a work of history, that it is a piece of historical scholarship, which doesn't mean you can't disagree with history, but there seems to be a real either inability or unwillingness to take the book for what it is. It's not just one person's experience, so sometimes people say, well, that's not what I experienced in evangelicalism as a powerful white man. I'm like, that doesn't surprise me that you maybe didn't, encounter all of these things. Say, I didn't experience everything in my book, right? It's not a memoir. It's a work of historical scholarship. And it's not just based on primary sources, although there are a ton of primary sources in the book. It's also based significantly on established secondary sources, on other history books that are themselves based on a wealth of archival research, right? And so I think that people, certain people who are not historians, not trained to read it this way, perhaps need to be reminded of that, and engage the book as a work of history built on this historical evidence, primary and secondary sources. Then you can quibble with interpretations, or you can go to my sources and say, does that source actually say that? But that's how you engage a work of history. Now, people who like the book or love the book also tend to engage it quite personally, right? And there happen to be thousands and thousands of people who read Jesus and John Wayne, which is a history of popular evangelicalism, popular culture, and say, this is the story of my life, right? And so they do connect with what they experience. Yeah. And I get letters. I've gotten hundreds of letters. I need to tally them up, probably close to 1,000. I get several a day from readers who then share with me how their own personal stories map onto Jesus and John Wayne. But then they can see that it's bigger than that. It's not just their personal experience, although they accuse me of reading their childhood diaries, but it's also like fitting their experience into this bigger history, right? Yeah. This is a story of my life, but I never understood how all these pieces fit together. Mm-hmm. And that's what the historical framework can do. That's what those secondary sources can do. It can take people's experience and make sense of it and show it's not just you. And this is part of something much bigger. And so that's what I've really seen in responses, both formal reviews and also informal responses to the book.
Well, I want to ask two more questions for you before we move to some of the questions from our listeners tonight. And when I read your book, Kristin, I thought, John Wayne. And I was telling the pastor today, I was shocked the number of times this came up in the history. So it's not a gimmick. It's not a marketing tool. It is, this happened. People talked about this. And I told Kristin when I first read the book, I wrote her a note. This is my life. I experienced virtually everything in that book. So, well, Beth, Kristin's talking about the 20th century and all these things that are happening now. And here you are, a medievalist.
I know.
And people say,
I'm an outlier.
What in the world is a medievalist? But the question is, what kind of leadership did women in the medieval period exercise? This, I think, is a surprise to many.
Yes, it is. Although I've already read a couple of people who said they liked everything about my book except for the medieval part because it was boring. And I thought, well, I don't know what I could do for you there. But nonetheless, one of the things that this disconnect that I experienced was that I knew how prevalent women were in the early church, from the ancient church through the early medieval period. And in fact, this is something that a lot of scholars, I think both Kristin and I, this is what, even though we do have some of our own personal research in our books, we are building on the shoulders of other people. I mean, the stuff that we talk about is stuff that everyone in our field kind of like knows. I mean, this isn't like this isn't surprising to academics. Yeah. It's just, so it's funny. And so, what we know as medieval scholars is we know that women played prominent roles, that there were female deacons in the early church. We know they were very prominent in the Eastern church, but there were also ones in the Western church. And in fact, they the role deacon began to be described as the role abbess in the early medieval world. And these were the women who ran these houses of monastics. And they didn't just run houses of women monastics. They also were heads over double monasteries, which means they ran houses of male monastics too. And this is something that most people, just simply don't know about. We also know that the medieval world considered Mary Magdalene to be the apostle to the apostles. I mean, that was very common knowledge. And everyone, and this most significant position in the early church. And they saw Mary Magdalene as the apostle to all of the other apostles. And so this was a prominent theme. And then, of course, we have women preaching. This is something else that people don't realize. And in fact, that we have people like Hildegard of Bingen who went on preaching tours throughout Central Europe. And one of the scholars that works on her said, nobody ever quoted Paul at her. Nobody ever told her that she couldn't preach. They wrote to her and said, wow, you really have good sermons. Can you give me advice about these things? And so this is what we have. We have women who are highly visible in the medieval world. And even though patriarchy still exists in the medieval world, as I talk about in my book, it's different. And women were still able to serve in leadership positions.
Well, Beth, I want to thank you for writing a book, not about medieval women in churches, which would have been helpful, but about the modern church where you illustrate with this, because many of us would like to read some stories about Marjorie Kemp, but 400 pages about that, I think. Okay, well, it was.
Well, yeah.
I like those parts. I thought they were really, really interesting. So, but all right, here's a big question for Kristin. And people have been asking me if I would ask you this question. So, how has the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, CBMW, nurtured a masculinist understanding of the Christian faith. And I'm guessing that we could sit back for the next 6 hours and have you have a discourse on this, but let's hear it.
Yes. Thank you for this question, CBMW. So, yeah, on the one hand, Jesus and John Wayne really kind of decenters theology, a kind of formal theology, in understanding evangelicalism and evangelical values and evangelical ideals of gender. It's not that theology isn't important, but there's a lot more than just, kind of the Bible here. And evangelicals identify as Bible-believing Christians, and, the authority of the scriptures is right up front and center in their self-identity. And so what often gets mixed is there's a lot of cultural influences on how they read the Bible, which verses they look to, which verses they ignore or just dismiss. So that's like the larger framework of the book. That said, CBMW is a great example of where both theology and culture really come together. And so CBMW, I think I describe it in the book as kind of a theological think tank on the one hand for this broader movement. And it was kind of fun for me to have CBMW review Jesus and John Wayne recently. Spoiler alert, they didn't like it. But that was one of the reviews that very much couldn't see it as a work of history. Not surprisingly, right? At CBMW, it's all what is God's word and not why do we think that this is God's word in this particular moment? So a real disconnect with what the book actually does. But they recently also came out with a kind of statement of defending complementarianism over against, I think Beth's work, Beth Moore, and Jesus and John Wayne, and really try to suggest that no, it's not all of these other things. It's just very, very limited, very, we're just talking, male headship in a very, very limited theological context. And so I thought, well, I actually have dozens of pages of notes on CBMW from their journal over the years. So huge shout out to my research assistant, Josh Parks, who compiled this originally. And so I just looked through that again, and I want to push back on this conception that no, complementarianism is not cultural, right? It's just biblical. And so here are some of the teachings that they have, packaged along with complementarianism and gendered authority. So they're very concerned about women serving in combat, because the essence of combat is to kill, slay, and destroy the enemy. And that purpose and essence aligns with the gender-based role and responsibilities of men. So men are made to kill, slay, and destroy. Women are not, right? And so let's see, a husband is no man if he lets his wife defend the home or defend the nation. He is no man at all. And a man needs to remember to assert authority over a wife. She needs to remember that you are her authority, otherwise her femininity will be compromised. Like this, if you read some of these things, this is like all over Jesus and John Wayne, like popular literature, popular advice, sermons, and it's right at the heart of CBMW. Exercising truth over emotion, they say, is distinctively manly. So separate truth from emotion, and they get to be gendered. Sexuality too. This is a theme of Jesus and John Wayne, and it's also in the pages of CBMW, that male sexuality, our men walk through a daily minefield of sexual temptation, every man's battle, right? And it's God's design for sex is that women meet those needs, their sexual needs, and a wife gets that this is like medicine to a man's soul. And a woman who leads men on by dressing provocatively or flirting with her eyes, she is complicit with the enemy, right? This is a lot that is entirely consistent with these cultural norms of femininity and masculinity. Raise your boys to be dominion takers. So boys, we all know they play with Legos and they sleep on superhero sheets, whereas girls like Barbie dolls and Sophia pillowcases, right? Again, there's a lot of cultural layers here that is being promoted by the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood and framed as just plain biblical theology when clearly we can see it's deeply enculturated, deeply situated historically and culturally. And what's interesting to me is that on the one hand, they insist that this is just pure biblical teaching, inerrant scriptures, and yet their own writings are just filled with these cultural ideals that then get packaged and sold as biblical.
So,
well,
Kristin,
go ahead.
I was just going to jump in because a friend, a fellow medieval scholar, actually emailed me today and had been reading my book and said, Beth, it really strikes me that I hadn't thought about it in a while, but the Jesus that we find, sort of, we do have this this image of the warrior Jesus in medieval sermons, but it's a very passive, emotional Jesus who gives up his life. And I mean, it's strikingly different from modern ideals about masculinity and the masculine warrior. And yet it is based, it's constructed from the same, it's biblical to the medieval world, just like this is biblical now. And it shows us how much it's constructed by culture.
Yeah, and our contemporary biblical warrior is based on William Wallace largely, right? Yep. Warrior masculinity. So,
at the beginning and throughout your book, Kristin, you talk about how evangelicalism is not simply a collection of the 4 or 5 doctrines.
Yeah.
I deeply appreciated this because this is my life. I grew up in this world, and there is an atmosphere that is breathed in that has nothing to do with those doctrines. And Ryan Burgie's new book, The Nuns, has pretty much demonstrated that politics is behind everything. And it just so coalesced at times for me with some of your argument that there is such a drive politically in this masculinist understanding that you have to ask the question that Ryan Burgie is asking: which comes first, the theology or the politics? And his answer is politics. And I think you confirm some of this. Yeah. Now, we're getting a pretty common question from some of the listeners. You're going to be asked these questions. I have been asked these questions, or this question. And I think it's an important question for all of us to consider because of church life. But how do we open up conversations about this topic with folks who are so deeply entrenched in the ideology of complementarianism, that it's biblical, and all of this questioning that Beth Allison Barr and Kristin Du Mez and Amy Bird are asking is creating anger, defensiveness, and pushback. What kind of advice do you have for people who say, I would like to bring this conversation into my church? So let's start with you, Beth.
Oh, well, I don't know if I'm a good one for that, because when we tried, we, got pushed out. We lost our job. So I don't know. It didn't work well for us. But I do think I am actually more hopeful than that. I do think that even though there are a lot of people who won't listen. I mean, I think this is too, like we all know, the Facebook arguments that you just should walk away from because they're not going to win anything. So I think there are some people like that you're going to find you're not going to win anything with. But there are a lot of people in churches who are questioning, and even in church, people who are defensive and angry. I mean, they'll still sometimes come back and ask questions. And I would say too, I've said this before, that I think the key to this in many churches is the women, because I think the women have borne the brunt of the damage that a lot of this has done to us. It's hurt men too, but women are the ones who are shoved, or who don't have a place at the table in all of this, and they're not able to voice their concerns. And so I think there's a lot more women in these systems who are asking questions. And that's the way I would present it, with just say, have you thought about it? Are you willing? Would you ask a question? And a very easy thing to do is like what I do with my students is I just let them look at Romans 16 and just have them read it. If somebody's only reading the ESV, I would ask them to look at it with another translation and say, why do you think this is? And just getting them to start asking those questions. So I'll let Kristin jump in. I have other thoughts too, but.
Yeah, I would say, I agree that there are just a lot of people who are rethinking things right now, women and men. My book is on masculinity, so I probably hear from more men proportionally. But there's just a lot of people who are finding, whatever stage of their life they're in, these boxes don't fit. Right. They don't fit their giftedness. They don't fit their actual relationships. And like you said, when you read the scriptures, the scriptures also don't fit neatly into these boxes. But I will also say that I'm just a big believer in the power of history. Right. And that's what both of our books have in common, obviously. But I think that our books kind of shift the conversation in a way that opens things up in a way that has been hard to do for a long time. Because there are brilliant books on egalitarianism and on countering complementarianism, and these conversations have been going on for decades now. And there are all kinds of resources there, like Christians for Biblical Equality houses all kinds of them, and you can go and they have resources and journals, and so that's there, and it's there for the taking. But what history has done, I think, is it shows us how we got to this point. It shows us, again, how these ideologies were constructed over time. It shows us that things haven't always been this way. And that has enormous power to open up the conversations again, because then the next question is, well, if they haven't always been this way, then how did we get to where we are now? And that's exactly what both of our books do. Right. Yeah. And so what I have found is that it only takes one person in a church, one person in a friend group, one person in an organization to say, hey guys, let's read this. Right. Let's read Jesus and John Wayne. Let's read The Making of Biblical Womanhood. It just takes one person brave enough to say that. And let's just have the conversation. And then amazing conversations happen. I have just been shocked to find Jesus and John Wayne being engaged and humbly received in some of the most conservative corners of white evangelicalism, because somebody says, hey guys, let's do this. Let's read it. And so it's really remarkable. And I know that Beth's book is already doing the same.
Well, and I'm thinking, Kristin, I'm thinking of the final words of your book, and, in which I know you weren't very hopeful at the time, but you said, this has been made, so maybe it can be unmade. Yeah. And I think, I think this can be unmade, and I think it can be unmade in many ways the same way it was made. And it was made through people being educated to think this way, and people being educated to think that masculine Christianity and biblical womanhood was actually biblical, which means that we can unmake it. Yeah. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's already happening. And so we're starting to see that now.
I would add that we have the power of examples. When I was a PhD student, I pulled up on my bicycle on a street in Cambridge, England, next to Morna Hooker, who was a New Testament scholar. And I was, I was in awe of her brilliance. And I said to her, good morning, Professor Hooker. I didn't know what else, but in my mind, this is what I said. You absolutely have changed my life. Any theory that women can't teach has been blown apart by you. And she has written some brilliant books. I also think that we need to have reasonable expectations. I think some people want to change the world all at once and change churches all at once. But getting heard is the first one. And Kristin, your point, or I think it was Kristin, let's just read this book.
Yeah.
That's a beginning step that'll be heard. And I tell my students who ask me this question, take a short step, but don't you dare back up.
Yes.
Don't take long steps, short steps, but don't back up. Don't back down, stay there. And I think we're seeing big changes. And this is why I think there's such vitriol in responding to the excellent presentations you've made. And I've noticed with Kristin's book, people aren't even responding to the evidence at all. It's gut level. If this is true, I'm wrong, I'm right, so this book is wrong.
Yeah, right.
And that's about how logical it is. Well, okay. One of the big issues in biblical complementarianism, if there is such a thing, which I don't think there is an appeal to Reformation. And Beth, I wonder if you could talk to us about how the Reformation altered the exercise of gifts by women. You've indicated that women were doing a lot of stuff in the medieval period. And what happened in the Reformation?
Yeah, so this is a conversation scholars have been having for years. And in many ways, what we know, and I talk about this in the book, that there's a lot of disagreement about the impact that it had and why it happened, et cetera. But sort of the agreement is that the role of wife got elevated. After, it's in the early modern era. It's not just because of Reformation theology. It got mapped on to Reformation theology in many ways, but the role of wife got elevated, and it got elevated so much that it began to exclude women from all other roles. I think women today are still experiencing this in, Protestant Christianity. What do you do if you don't get married? What do you do if you don't feel called to get married, et cetera? And so, I think there's a lot in the medieval world. There was space for these women. They didn't have to get married. Your highest calling was actually not to get married. And so that was the more mundane thing to do. If you were really godly in the medieval period, then you didn't get married. But in the after the Reformation, that's switched. And now if you're godly, you got married. And if you got married, that meant that legally, and this actually isn't theological, this is legally, you are under the authority of your husband. And so what we begin to see happen is that this idea of a godly wife then gets, with her role as being under the authority of her husband legally, kind of come together. And so after the Reformation, we see this emphasis that the best a woman can be is to be a godly married woman under the authority of her husband. And this is, I think, is one of the biggest change for evangelical women. And so I think I write that the role of wife got elevated, but at a price. And the price was other roles for women, as well as their ability to be leaders in the church.
We have a question for Dr. Du Mez. What story? I like this question. What story did you leave on the cutting room floor that you wish you had been able to fit in Jesus and John Wayne?
There was so much on the cutting room floor.
You've told me some of them. I'm trying to think.
Yeah. Since my editor's not listening in, I'm trying to keep this from him. My original manuscript was 60,000 words over. So I had a lot of cutting to do. I just wrote fast and long. And so I had to pull it a lot off. A few things. I lost a really good kind of telenovela joke about Jerry Falwell Jr., but that was in legal review. So that wasn't because of word count. And let's see, I in the proposal stage already, I lost a chapter. And I'm okay with it because I think it made sense for the structure of the book. But I think a lot of Christian readers especially are missing that, like wish it would have been there, because it was a chapter on alternative evangelical masculinities, right? That there are other ways of being an evangelical man that coexist in tension with, sometimes together with, this more militant model. And I'd really wanted to also showcase some of the really much healthier models of Christian manhood, like Nate Pyle and Carolyn Custis James and others, right? I'd wanted to, like, if you're reading all this bad stuff, let me show you there's other ways to be a Christian man. And I was, I think, rightly told that, that'd be great if you're writing for a Christian publisher or even an academic publisher, but for trade publishing, you tell one story and you pull that thread all the way through. But I think that, so for this book, I'm glad I made that choice. But I think readers would have certain readers would have done well with something like that. There's other things I just didn't have space for, and so I'll tell you all the things that I wish were in the book. I wish I had space to do more on economics and free market economics and prosperity gospel and all of that. So I'm going to make up for that in the next book. And also I had done research examining the global export of these ministries, this popular culture, this ideology. And I just mentioned that briefly in 1 or 2 paragraphs in the conclusion, but I have a lot more research on that. And at a certain point, I realized this is another book, essentially. Yeah. And since Jesus and John Wayne has come out, it's gotten a lot of international attention. And so I've heard from Christians in Kenya and in Brazil and in the Netherlands and in the UK and in China and Australia, like all over the world, saying this has come to us too. And it's through the popular culture. Wow. And they're wrestling with it. And so we're having some really interesting global conversations. I'm going to be having more. And so that is another chapter yet to be told, I think, and a very important one.
That's funny, Kristin, because that was the chapter that I would have ended. If I'd had one more chapter, it would have been the global import or export of biblical womanhood. And so that,
and devastating. I mean, stories of, not just limiting women's gifts, but also the sexual abuse in Christian organizations globally that maps onto this.
Yeah. There's a whole story there.
Oh boy,
so,
oh boy.
There's a whole book there, really. That's one book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's a question that I think both of you could answer. What is your view on persuading other women who are comfortable with complementarianism? And, are you trying to persuade them that their view is unbiblical?
And we're both shaking our heads. No, I don't think either of us want to do that. What we want them to know is that it's not unbiblical to believe the opposite. That's what's really happened here, is that complementarianism has managed to convince people that it's part of the gospel, and that if you don't adhere to it, then you are going on the slippery slope away, and that you don't read the Bible as well as they do. And so what I would like women to know is that if you do choose to do this and to read the Bible this way, that's fine, you can, but you also cannot say that it's part of the gospel. So that's, I think, what I would want to do.
Oh, I absolutely agree that, there are, for women who find that their gifts are exercised well in a complementarian relationship. I would also say that, we're using this word complementarianism, and I mean, we have to, but every complementarian relationship, like in actuality, looks different, right? One from the other. And a lot of people pay lip service to complementarian beliefs, but their actual marriages might be a lot more flexible than, and sometimes they feel guilty about it. Sometimes like, whatever. But they're on the ground. There's a lot of variation here. So it's never my goal to go and tell somebody to change the way that if they feel fulfilled and if they feel that they are serving God in that mode, by all means do it. But as Beth says, it's when you start to tell other people and other women, this is the only way to do it. And it might work beautifully for you and your husband. And maybe he is a lovely person and would never dream of abusing authority. And, that's all well and good. But for many women and men, it's not a good fit. And then I've heard so many stories of women and men who end up walking away from it all, from their marriages, from Christianity sometimes, because they cannot fit it into this mold. They don't fit into this mold. And so yes, I would never say you can't be compliment that's unbiblical. No, that's the way that you are finding your way to live faithfully, and more power to you. What I will say is, but then you think about how you raise your children too, right? And I've had some poignant conversations with women recently too, who say, we believe these books that you're writing. We're challenged, but we can't change, right? We can't change our lives. We can't walk away from, but they said, but we do want something different for our daughters. And so that's just been really amazing.
that, Kristin, is what people, I've had, when people who are in complementarian circles, many of them, they've been emailing me, sending me, and they're like, I thought this way until I saw my daughter, and I saw how God had gifted her, and it made me question. And so, I think this is it too, is that just the actual experiences in the church and seeing our children who are gifted can also help move this conversation. But I would also put a caveat there that even though lots of women are uncomfortable and everything goes well for them, that complementarian system often doesn't work for people who are outside of wealthier, upper middle class white evangelicalism. It's not the reality of women of color. It's not the reality of women in lower economic systems. They can't ever live up to those ideals because of the economic constraints on them, because they never had the chance to go to college. And so I just think we have to have a wider lens than how our own life works. Yes. We have to realize that what works for us might be hurting other people. And so I think we have to be conscious of that.
I'm going to maybe have a little tension with some of these viewpoints. I tolerate Christian complementarianism, but I don't think it's biblical. And I'll tell you why. I see in the pages of the Bible a giftedness of women being exercised when the Spirit empowers women to do certain things that is restricted in complementarianism. I agree with you. I know a lot of complementarian people who have wonderful marriages. And I'm with Kristin. I think they actually are deconstructing their complementarianism by the way they live. And I think Russell Moore has said something like this. Yes. So it might be true. But I think there is something essentially problematic about complementarianism for structures. When allegations come in from women about churches, and the only people who get to hear the allegations are white men with power, the course of action is going to go in a certain direction. Then if women were empowered to listen to those same stories, it's going to shift. Yeah. So I tolerate it. I understand that this is a part of the Christian world. It's a part of the world. But I don't think it is biblical. Complementarianism is a social construct of the late 20th century, the mid 20th century, that's more like Leave It to Beaver than it is like first century Christianity. And I think we need to call that out and push against it. And at the same time, not try to ruin people's lives. Right. I think both of you are really sensitive to women who are perfectly happy.
Yes.
But that perfectly happiness is the nesting in a social construct that is not biblical.
Well, it's patriarchy is really what it is.
Yes,
yes. And this has been continuous throughout women's experiences throughout history. So I do believe in calling a spade a spade. And so this is complementarianism is patriarchy. And Christian patriarchy doesn't look any different from secular patriarchy. So I think, it's hard. This is a hard issue.
Yeah, I think too, again, complementarianism. So what are we talking about? If we're talking about kind of roles that people inhabit because they really find those fitting of what they are good at. And so I think I was talking more on a lower level, right? Hey, if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, and you find a way to do that, and that's what complementarian is for you. I'm definitely not going to say no, go get a job, right? Like that kind of more day to day. But yes, when it comes to power, right? To me, it ultimately comes down to understandings of power. So we can call it patriarchy, but this is power, and I think that's where fundamentally it is unbiblical, or it goes against the heart of the gospel, if I can put it that way.
I think that's
I understand the gospel, right? And actually my whole first book kind of turned around this thought that, now, wait a minute, why would men claim authority over women, men who are following a Christ who divested himself of power, right? That to me is,
yes.
And wouldn't you only do that if you were in cahoots with the devil, not if you were following this Christ, right? That's kind of the more extreme. This, I'm quoting Catherine Bushnell, a 19th century Christian feminist, right? And when I read that, and she has this elaborate theology, right? And when I read this, I thought, she's got a point there, right? So fundamentally, what is the gospel? Who is Jesus to you? And what does it mean to follow Jesus? And does that look like usurping power over anyone? You know, take gender out of the picture. Or does it look like this revolutionary, radical divestment of power? And so, yes, amen to that, Scott.
No, I agree. And that's, I kind of like Lucy Peppiatt's term that it's hierarchicalist instead of complementarianism. And I was like, yep, it is. That's really what it is. Yeah,
I agree. And, you know, complementarianism was stole from the original egalitarians. I don't know if you know about this term, but it was swiped because hierarchy and patriarchy aren't so popular terms. Okay, here's a question. This is a question that I think is worthy of being asked, but the person who's asked the question has said you don't have to answer it. Okay, I can answer it, but it's not a problem for me. Both of you teach at institutions that have constituencies that are in part socially conservative. Do your institutions caution you not to provoke the alumni and trustees?
Nope, not yet.
Yeah.
I'll let you know if that changes. I mean, when Shapiro's Daily Wire picked up Jesus and John Wayne a few weeks back, that resulted in a lot of letters calling for my firing for a few days. But no, I've never been told to not do what I do. I haven't been told that I shouldn't be on Twitter. So kudos to Calvin University for that. I see what I do as being fully aligned with our mission of being Christ's agents of renewal. And until I'm told otherwise, I'm working under that assumption. So
no, I agree. I've never at Baylor. In fact, some of my greatest supporters here are some of the people in the administration. And so I don't want to, anyway. So no, I have never received any pushback in my position to not be able to teach or research what I feel like I should.
Very good. Now we're getting to the last question here. Can Beth and Kristin speak to how patriarchy, and this has just been mentioned only briefly so far, can you speak to how patriarchy hurts people of color?
Oh, Kristin, which one of us wants to go first with that? I mean, they're the same thing. Racism is part of the patriarchal system. It teaches, patriarchy teaches us that some people, simply because of the way they are born, because of their bodies, are better than other people. And this translates very easily from sex differences to color, to race differences, to ethnicities. And so, I mean, it's no surprise to me that they go hand in hand. And in fact, we know that with that part of the reason that the biblical passages on women be silent, that they were resurrected and the household codes were resurrected, was to help keep slavery enforced. They go exactly together, and they always have.
Yeah, I found too, I set out to write a book about gender, and very quickly I found I was writing a book about race too. Yeah. So the white evangelical, the white in the subtitle is not superfluous. This is what I'm writing about. And this ideal of militant Christian manhood is absolutely a white ideal. My first clue was when I was looking at all these books and looking at who their heroes were. And it was William Wallace, and it was Teddy Roosevelt, and it was Confederate generals, interestingly, General MacArthur as well. And it was John Wayne, right? And then even if we look at John Wayne, on screen, he was the valiant white man, the cowboy fighting the Indians, or the, fighting, always subduing through violence non-white populations, the Japanese, the Mexicans, the Vietnamese, right? And what I came to see is historically too, this ideal arose during the Cold War era. It arose over against the civil rights movement. Evangelicals mobilized to defend segregation and to defend their private Christian academies. And race just permeates this, and the ideal of militant white protector who will defend faith, family, and nation, right? This is about Christian nationalism too. That is a white masculine ideal. And that's why it dovetails so closely with law and order politics, right? And with this militant conception of the white man enforcing patriarchal authority over not just his family, but the social order as well. So yes, race and gender always intertwined.
And historians have known this for a long time. We've always had the little, we've talked about this for a long time. So it's funny to me how little some of these historical conversations have made it into broader evangelical culture, which I think is what both Kristin and I are really trying to do here.
The various laws about slaves in the first century, one of the most alarming ones is the unwillingness in Roman law, Greek law, for a male slave to be called a man. And this is picked up in the United States. This was picked up in the United States.
Yeah.
And slaves become 3/5 of a person in order to degrade their status. But the fear of black slave males being men led once again to calling them boys, and this became a degrading status. So, I hadn't thought that much about that connection. That's where my head went, and so this is a serious conversation.
Sorry, Scott. I was just going to say, I actually had a whole part in my Paul chapter. It was about twice as long as it originally was because I got into race and all of this. And my editor very kindly said, Beth, this is a different book. And so I had to cut, like Kristin, I had to cut all that out. But it's so hard to not talk about patriarchy and not talk about race too.
Both of you have said something, and I'll close with this. Both of you have talked about cutting in your manuscripts. And I think a lot of people don't realize this. I often tell people that when I publish a book, about half of it, about half more could be in the book that is in some file or just deleted into cyberspace. And this is, I want to commend both of you for the shearing process that you did in pruning back your text so that it stayed with the right pace. Both of these books have marvelous pace where we don't get lost and go, oh, how long is this section going to last? I mean, there is a delicate process of editing, and you both produced not only wonderful books about scholarship and exposing something in the social network in the churches, but you also have demonstrated pleasing prose that is convincing and compelling. And I would like to close with just a huge thanks to both of you for these wonderful books, and a prayer for blessing of the Lord upon your lives and your teaching and the next book that comes out, because we're all waiting. Although, Beth, you have a lot of work to do before that with all this promotion. And Kristin's paperback version, I don't know if it's okay if I say this, is coming out in June, and it's going to be a relaunch. And I can't wait for both of these books to get all this attention. So thank you much. And thanks all you listeners for this wonderful time tonight.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. I know I've said this to you privately, but let me just say this publicly too. For years and years before we knew each other personally, I had seen you support women, Christian women, in all kinds of different ways. And so it's no surprise that we find you here supporting our work. So I wanted to thank you for that. I also wanted to thank everybody who tuned in, our readers, our supporters, because it is you guys who are making these books what they are. You are bringing them into the spaces where they most need to be. And it has just been incredible to watch that with Jesus and John Wayne, and to see the exact same thing happening with the making of biblical womanhood. So just thank you to all of you. We see what you're doing, and we're so grateful.
Yes, we are. I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for Scott and Kristin here. Both of them. I would not have made it through the Making of Biblical Womanhood without Kristin. She gave me a pep talk at a time when I was thinking about quitting. And she also gave me the advice, Scott, that I think what you said. She said, make it turn fast. And that's what she said. She said, make it turn fast.
Good,
and so,
good advice.
Yeah, it was good advice, and I finished it. So y'all might owe the Making of Biblical Womanhood to Kristin, getting me through with that pep talk. But nonetheless, thank you, everyone. And thank you all for helping me have such a wonderful first book launch week. I mean, this has been tremendous and incredible. And so I'm so grateful. And I'm also grateful for Scott putting my blogs up so long ago, because that helped also lead to the Making of Biblical Womanhood. So,
yeah, good blogs.
Yeah. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.